Okay. Welcome to Module 5, Language, for SLP 364, Cultural Issues in Schooling. April 25th to May 1st with your guided reading journal, due May 1st. And your paper, Who Am I?, is also due May 1st by 11:55 p.m. with our next live chat on May 2nd. In the United States, we will be seeing a racial and ethnic demographic shift by the year 2060. As you can see on this graph, we will have a huge increase in ethnicity and racial diversity. Up to 57% of the U.S. population by 2060 will be non-white. So what does this mean? As SLPs, we need to prepare ourselves for a more culturally and linguistically diverse future in this country. Monolingual students will be a rarity. So what does California have to do with this? Because we're in the state of California, I wanted to let you know that the most diverse student population in the world is in California. We have 100 languages spoken in the homes of these students, and our student population is more of a majority minority, meaning that there are more minority students in California, which makes them the majority. 41% of our students speak a language other than English at home, and a quarter of all California public school students are struggling to learn English languages in schools. So there are lots of people, as Jack O'Connell says, that think of diversity as a problem, but it's not. I mean, think about the potential of diversity in today and tomorrow's global economy. The more diverse we are and the more diversity we have in our state means that we'll be able to lead our nation and the world economy because we can communicate with a variety of people. Nearly 1.6 million students in kindergarten through grade 12 are English language learners, also the equivalent of 1 in 4, so a quarter. This represents almost 1/3 of the English language learners in all of the United States, and they're enrolled in almost every district in California, and the majority of the schools in the state have these students. So 85% of these students in California are Spanish speaking, and my school actually has the highest number in all of Escondido of Spanish-speaking students. Our numbers are extremely high, with 2.2% that are also Vietnamese in California, and then 1.5% are Hmong. So who is considered an English language learner in California? It varies by state, but in California, an English language learner is a K-5 student who, based on a test, an objective test, has not yet developed listening, speaking, reading, or writing proficiency in English to a level where they can participate in the regular school program like everybody else. So these students are sometimes referred to as a limited English proficient student, LEP, and you'll see this a lot in legal verbiage. The process for identifying these students is called the California English Language Development Test. The California English Language Development Test has 4 purposes. So to identify new students who are English language learners in K-12 students, to determine their current level of English proficiency. It also is used to monitor them on an annual basis, as well as determine when they've met the criteria to become a fluent student and are no longer an English language learner. So, what are the CELT levels? Number 1 is beginning. Here's an example where a student is primarily level 1, and this was in kindergarten. These are both 4th grade students. Level 2 is where a student is considered early intermediate. Level 3 is where they are intermediate. Level 4 is early advanced, and level 5 is considered advanced. So on these 2 different graphs, I have 2 4th graders. The first is a typically developing 4th grader. This is their score in kindergarten, 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th grade. As you can see, each year their scores have steadily gone up, and most students tend to stick in the level 3 for a little while because it is the most cognitively demanding section where they're learning the most academic language, and it takes longer for them to jump out of level 3 and into level 4. This student is actually a student of mine. This is his CELT scores, and again, he's a 4th grader, and they're both Spanish speakers. In kindergarten, you can see all level 1s. 1st grade, a little bit of a jump in writing. There's some jump in reading and speaking, but overall, the level continues to stay very low. So the highest he got was a level 2 and has now gone down. Language terms. So some of this can be complex, and because I'm a speech language pathologist and this is kind of my passion and I live this every day, I can kind of gloss over some things. So if you have any questions regarding any of the terms I go over in this lecture, please let me know. So L1 is considered the first or primary language, and this doesn't mean that it's always the dominant language. And for many of our students here in San Diego, their first language is Spanish. But it can also be any other variety of languages because we have people that come to San Diego from all over the place. Second language, or L2, is the language that they learn after. So it's whatever their other language is that they are learning, and it doesn't have to stop there. Many of you speak more than 2 languages, so you just keep adding L3, L4, and so on. What is a language disorder, and how is it different than a language difference? So language disorder means that the student has deficits in the understanding or production of both their first and second languages. So the language disorder is present in both languages that the child uses. Whereas a language difference is the normal process, meaning it's typical for language development to have an impact on L2. So their first language is developing normally, but their second language isn't, and that's totally normal. Okay, so a word about dialect. ASHA, which is the governing board for speech language pathologists, also known as the American Speech Language and Hearing Association, and you can visit asha.org if you want to learn more, states that social dialects are not a disorder and they are not a pathological form of speech and language. So what does that mean? If a student has a dialectical difference, this is a typical pattern where the first language influences the second language. So think of this as far as accents would go. And then the other kind of dialect is like the social dialect, where if you're from Boston, you speak differently versus California. And you have to be sure to ask what dialects the parents or the students speak, because there are different dialects even in Mexico. Like I have a few students who speak Conobal. Here's a little comic for you. It's a boot. A boot what? So it's a Canadian dialect. All right, so what is simultaneous language acquisition? This is where students are exposed to both languages from infancy, so at the same time. And they don't really have any interfering from the 2 languages. It's very minimal. So they're learning it at the same time, and they don't really notice that they're learning 2 languages. Sequential acquisition, which is what most of our students are here in this area due to the large number of immigrants. The child is exposed to their first language during infancy, and then L2 is introduced at a later time. Sequential learners show greater diversity in the rates and stages of acquisition, so this is where things get a little bit muddy. So if L2 is introduced sequentially before there's really a strong L1, this is where problems can occur and L1 may regress while the L2 is being acquired, and this is where students have language loss. They start becoming alienated from their parents because they're really learning the L2 and they're losing a lot of the L1 because they never had a strong basis in L1 to begin with. And we see this quite a bit in, preschool and kindergarten, even not first grade students, where they've never really had a strong basis in their L1 foundation. These students can achieve lower test scores in both L1 and L2, which makes them look language impaired, which they're not. Some other variables that can affect language acquisition would be things like motivation. Are they motivated to learn the new language? Are their parents motivated? Personality. Are they an introvert? Are they an extrovert? Or do they have low self-esteem? Are they assertive? Is the child anxious? How is their socioeconomic status? Is it the same as the other students at the school, or is it completely different, resulting in lower self-esteem? Some other things are things like avoidance, where a student may avoid using the new language because they don't want to be made fun of. So a student's performance may be low because they're not wanting to participate, but their actual competence could be much higher. And this can just even happen in monolingual students because they don't want to do the work or they don't want to be called out on. I know I used to be one of the more quiet students, so I may avoid things, but that doesn't mean that my competence is low. It just means that I didn't want to perform in front of people. which is no longer the case. So other things are things like routines. Students may learn whole phrases like "have a nice day," but they don't know what those mean. They've just heard other people saying them and they're, reporting them back. One that I hear a lot of my students say is "Swami." Like, we went to the Swami yesterday, and it took me a long time to understand that they were trying to say swap meet, and they don't know that there are two different words. So we had a lesson on what swap means and what meet means, and that there are two different things, and that when you put them together, it's not one word, it's a phrase. So that was an interesting lesson I had with my students. Practice opportunities. Does the student have opportunities to practice L2 at home with friends? The student may only speak L2 at school and nowhere else. There's also the impact of high versus low output generators. We talked about this a little bit already, that extroverts are high generators and introverts are low generators. SLP should familiarize themselves with student language models. So who is the student interacting with on a daily basis? And if the models are poor, like if their parents aren't using correct grammar or if their parents are trying to speak in broken English, they don't really have good language models. So they may not be disordered. It may just be that they don't have good models. So we need to educate parents and friends and caregivers and things like that. All right, common underlying proficiency. This is the theory that if you build up one language positively, it will affect the development of another language. Therefore, it should be easier and more beneficial. And this is what we need to explain to parents, that being bilingual is a good thing, where if you have a strong L1 foundation, you can transfer the rules of that first language and use that foundation to develop your second language. Older students with a strong L1 foundation will typically perform well in academics. What is a semilingual student? So these are students who don't really receive any support in their first language, and then they try to learn L2 without that common underlying proficiency. And so neither language is intact, and there's negative cognitive effects, and they fail academically. And they often look language impaired, but they're not. They're just not strong in any language, and they stay that way for a while. Sometimes you can see this with simultaneous learners because they're not quite dominant in either language. And you can also see this as well with language impaired students. So really you have to figure out, is it the result of being semilingual? Is it because they're sequentially learning, or is it because of a disorder? So these are the students that are really difficult to tell. And really what you want to look for is there any progress? And if there isn't, it's most likely a language impairment. This goes through the different floors. So at the top, we have balanced bilingual proficiency, additive bilingualism, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a bit. But they're a balanced person who is bilingual, hooray, in both languages, so they can communicate in either language very successfully. The second floor is that they're non-balanced bilinguals, where they have a strong L1, but they're still developing the L2. And then the first floor are the students who are semilingual or limited bilingual, where they're low competence in L1 and L2. And like I said, these are the students that we have difficulty evaluating as teachers and special education staff, because it's hard to weed out what is causing this semilingualism. Is it lack of, good interventions? Is it because they just haven't had enough time? Is it because of a disorder? What is it, and how do we figure this out? And this is where you really need to use your professional judgment and as a team make a decision about what to do. And this image is from Dr. Rosemary McKibben's book on working with students who are multicultural and also have language impairments. It's a great book. All right, so our book explains a little bit that BICS and CALP are not really the best theory, but according to speech pathologists, this is usually the theory we use about language development. So basic interpersonal communication skills, this was developed by Cummins, and this is where it's the theory that it takes about 2 years to develop a native-like speaking under ideal conditions, meaning that you can communicate with friends on a very basic level, ask questions and things like that in a social setting where it's not very demanding, it's very context-based, and there's usually contextual support for the interaction. Whereas cognitive academic language proficiency takes 5 to 7 years to develop native-like conditions. This is under ideal conditions, meaning it has to be like the perfect setting for it to take 5 to 7 years. What are ideal conditions? It means that there's support in L1 and L2. But if the conditions are not ideal, the cognitive academic language proficiency can take up to 10 years to develop at a native language level. And what CALP is, it's things like reading, writing, math, science. It's more of the tier 2 language, the more abstract things that are harder to understand, as well as things like idioms and the more complex language. And this is something that I see a lot with the schools where I work, that say in 4th and 5th grade, the students' SELT level isn't really improving, and the teachers start to freak out that the students aren't learning fast enough. But if you look at this theory, under ideal conditions in the perfect bilingual program, it can take 5 to 7 years, meaning the kid could be, in 5th, 6th grade for it to really be normal and, bilingual. Whereas most of our programs, sadly, are less than ideal. So it can take up to 10 years, meaning later in middle school. And a lot of these teachers and districts, even like mine, are being forced and, questioned as to why their students aren't progressing fast enough. But we're really going against what science is saying, that it can take 10 years. That's a long time. So just something to consider. And you have to consider how many years they've been in school. It's not 10 years old, it's 10 years of school, because this is academic language and they develop this in school. So additive bilingualism is the idea that this is where it's a good thing. This is more ideal situations where they'll be learning that CALP quicker, where their L1 is nurtured and it's developing along with the L2, and this is the best way to do it. Whereas subtractive, which is sadly most of our school systems, where L1's not really nurtured, or it's kind of sort of looked at, and it's replaced by L2 very quickly, which results in language loss in L1, which results in a bunch of students who are semilingual and who are struggling in school. And there's something we have to do about this, especially with the race and ethnicity shift in our country. So what would the ideal bilingual education look like? According to Roseberry McKibben, it would be a minimum of 6 years of bilingual instruction, meaning kindergarten through 5th grade. So in kindergarten and 1st grade, 90% of education would be in the primary language and 10% would be in English. And then by grade 6, it would still be 50-50 language education. And right now in my school, we have a structured biliteracy program, and by 5th grade, there's no Spanish support really. That's super fast. So we're going from 90% in kindergarten to none by 5th grade. I mean, it's a little bit ridiculous what they're trying to do in 6 years. So really it's not ideal, which is why we're not seeing students become fluent in English as fast as we could be, because they're really not helping them in Spanish or their first language as much as they should be. So most of the programs in my school and in California are called sheltered English immersion. I've also heard them called structured English immersion. This is where English language acquisition is taught in the classroom. Instruction is in English, and there's curriculum and presentations designed for children who are learning the language. And this is what we call designated or integrated English language development time. So the students are usually grouped by their SELT score, and then they are, there's embedded things in the classroom like visuals and talking about background knowledge. There's specific, for some districts, curriculum that they use to explain the differences between the language and provide support in English and Spanish. And our students actually have a designated ELD time where they go at a specific time to a different classroom based on their level, and they get smaller group support for what they need to work on. So the California Department of Education has actually stated that there's a legal obligation to provide at least a minimum program elements of ELD, formerly known as ESL, because students need to access the core curriculum. And if they're not getting ELD support, they're not able to access school the way that they should. And this is a court case from 1981. All right, so the best way they have shown in past research is to have a dual language or two-way immersion program, because this would cause the most benefit for both English dominant speakers and then students who are English language learners. So in this program, class is taught in both languages, and both English only students and the ELs would learn each other's languages. So it's a two-way process, and it's really beneficial for both people. The only problem is that, what if you have 7 different minority students who all speak different languages? How do you decide what the 2 languages of the class will be? I mean, the more diversity we get in this country, the harder these programs are going to be. Right now in California, these two-way programs would be really, not very hard, because if you live in an area that's highly Hispanic, you could do a lot of Spanish two-way immersion programs, whereas now we're finding, even I am, that we have more Arabic and Tagalog and Hmong, and there's all these different languages now, that having a two-way immersion program can be really challenging, because how would you decide what the 2 languages really are? So this is another thing from Dr. Roseberry McKibben, and she created this because many of our students are misdiagnosed as being special ed, when really they're just needing more time, because they're adequate in their basic interpersonal communication skills, but they're not adequate yet in the academic language. And the teachers freak out and go, oh my goodness, they're not doing well on standardized tests. They're not performing very well on anything in the classroom. They're kind of stagnant. What do I do? And then we test them for special ed, and they're still not doing very well, when they're really just needing more time, or they could actually be one of our students, or they may need more time. So this is where teachers gathering data and coming with all the interventions and things that they've tried over the years really matter, where you need to look at all of the data as a whole and as a team, figure out, is the student progressing? How many years have they been here? Looking at every little piece of language. And I'm an author on the communication severity scales, and this has a worksheet for students who could be at risk. So it has a an example of how to identify, is the student at risk for being speech and language impaired, or are they just typically developing? And I will post a screenshot of that for all of you. So what is really the bottom line here? So as teachers and SLPs, we need to be aware that many of our students will be exposed to more than one language. There is this race and ethnicity shift. It's happening. We're living in it right now. And it's happening so fast that educators are having a really hard time keeping up with the change. And we're going to be seeing it happening. I mean, all of you are going to be part of this process if you become an educator. And if a student is exposed to more than one language, their progress will be slower than monolingual peers to start. But this doesn't mean that they're disordered. They just require a different kind of support. And it's our job as educators to provide this support. So districts all over the U.S. right now are trying to find a way to best teach English language learners, and there really is no right answer. So it's kind of in a process of trial and error right now. Even in my district, we're constantly trying to improve and find better ways to track data and monitor progress. And then once we have the baseline information, how do we address teaching another language? It's not an easy thing to do, especially when there are so many different languages. So really, this is something I deal with on a daily basis. And my school was very bad with misdiagnosing students. I had 96 students on my caseload when I arrived to my school. And because this is my specialty, I was able to drop my caseload down to about 55. So I was able to dismiss about 41 students who were incorrectly identified as speech and language impaired, when really they were just second language learners. And it's a very complex task that's even I'm still learning, even though it's my specialty. There's always something new, which is why I love this job so much. So if you have any questions, please let me know. This is something that I have a lot of information on, and it's hard to limit it to a short amount of time and really give you just the basics. So if you have any further questions about any of this and how I assess these students, please give me a call or send me an email. And I will see you on May 2nd. Bye.